This is the
Five Stars
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. What do you guys want to talk about?
Well, we are edging closer to some big events coming up, both in the classic and modern reviews. It's that time of the year where wrestling is historically very busy. NWA getting set for the big Starrcade event, WWE getting ready to run its annual Survivor Series. Lots of big and notable events coming down the pike. And I guess AEW is doing something too. Whatever their show's called, Full Gear. And we will be talking about all of it within the next couple weeks. For this show, it is kind of back to the status quo. And if you are tuning into the Five Starr Wrestling Report for the first time, make sure to subscribe, comment, and like the show. Be sure to stop in every Monday and Friday for new content, be it on YouTube or Rumble. You can find us on either platform. This weekend, we got the Retro Raw report to run down, which probably won't take a whole lot of time. Another one of those episodes where there wasn't a whole lot going on, at least not anything worth spending a great deal talking about. Then we'll do the SmackDown report from this past Friday. Some interesting things happening on that particular show, much of which had very little follow-up from the Crown Jewel event. It is kind of bizarre how that always seems to be the case with those Saudi shows. Like WWE will go out of their way to piece together this really big card with a lot of their top attractions, but it's almost like a completely separate world from what goes down on the television show in the States. It's because like immediately after that show goes down, they pretty much go right into their next set of programs, really not dwelling all that much on anything that goes down at the actual Crown Jewel show. You know, aside from a few clips and highlights, I guess. Not really saying I have a problem with it, but I don't know. How long has that whole relationship been going on with Saudi Arabia? It's been a few years, right? That whole relationship is the weirdest thing to happen in wrestling in the last 20-odd something years. Kind of feels like one of those abusive relationships where you know one of the parties really isn't comfortable doing business with the other, but they're almost handcuffed into doing so because of all the money they're getting out of it. But, I mean, I guess for only running 2 shows a year, it's like, whatever, we'll do it. No one really wants to do it, but we're getting paid. Tell you what, though, sometimes I get the sense of being in an abusive relationship whenever I watch some of these retro Raws from back in the day. Never said the 93 period of the WWF was a particularly good period. It's just where the archives begin in the Raw series, so we're seeing where things started and where they ended up going a few years down the road. I mean, pretty much from now until, I would say about early to mid-96 when Austin started coming into his own. I mean, Raw was practically every vision of how Vince McMahon wanted to portray professional wrestling on a mainstream platform. Lots of goofy characters, lots of big bumbling guys, most of whom couldn't work a lick. Lots of slapstick comedy up and down the show. And, well, like I said, not my favorite period in the wrestling business. But when you factor in how lame WCW was around that same point too, you got to pick your battles. So we open this particular episode of Raw, this would be the November 15th, 1993 edition, by recounting last week's brawl with the Macho Man and Crush. And if you watched last week's Retro Raw report, it was pretty much the only noteworthy thing on that entire program. Looking back, I could not recall a single thing else that happened on that entire show outside the Crush Savage fight. And conspicuous by his absence, Macho Man was banned from commentary duty this week to ensure that nothing got out of control again. Of course, Bobby Heenan being sure to interject by saying that unlike the Macho Man, Heenan is able to control his temper whenever there's someone in the ring that he wants to get his hands on. Perhaps Razor Ramon, for example. Because that sounds like someone the Brain would want to pick a fight with. So Razor wrestled the Brooklyn Brawler, and we learned during the ring intro here that as of the previous week, Shawn Michaels was reinstated after being suspended for not fulfilling contractual obligations of defending the Intercontinental Championship. And we've already covered that whole story, so I'm not going to do another deep dive into Shawn Michaels failing drug tests in 1993 in the middle of the steroid scandal. I still can't believe they ended up trusting that guy to put the world title on him a couple years down the road, but I mean, we are going to be covering that period in due time. Spoiler alert, wasn't a particularly good era. Really not much to say about this particular match. Lombardi tried to jumpstart Razor before the bell, but that lasted all of about 30 seconds before Razor fired back on him. They did some spots for a couple minutes, and eventually Razor went over with the Razor's Edge. Only other thing of note I took away from this was Bobby Heenan referring to the Bret Hart-Shawn Michaels IC title match from Survivor Series 92, wherein he threw in a bit of dialogue referring to Bret's family as, and I quote, the Fart Hamily. And whereas we know historically that Vince McMahon loves himself some poop jokes, his only comeback for this line was, Bobby Heenan, please, this is a family show. You know deep down Vince was smiling at that joke. So after that, we went to a Crush pre-tape, trying his damnedest to be a menacing heel, and on top of the hideous acting, it is made 10 times hokier by the fact that he is still doing that fucking fake Hawaiian accent. Telling the Macho Man to stay out of his way, brother. Yeah, sorry. Even as a kid, I could never take Crush seriously as a top guy. Lord, how they tried, and Lord, how it miserably failed every time. Then we had a plug for the Yokozuna Bret Hart WWF title match at the upcoming Survivor Series Showdown event on the 21st of November. A rematch that dates all the way back to WrestleMania 9. That was like 8 months ago. And they are now just revisiting this feud and giving the people the long-awaited title rematch for Bret after 8 months. Good Lord. I mean, to be fair, Bret was pretty much spinning his wheels for most of 93, doing that terribly botched feud with Jerry Lawler that never got off the ground. It's actually kind of astonishing when you look back in 93 and realize they prolonged Bret Hart getting his WWF title rematch for almost the entire year after losing the strap at the previous year's WrestleMania. Now, granted, a lot of that had to do with Hogan being an egotistical prick and not wanting to do business with Bret, not dropping the strap like a professional would do. But to think Bret spent almost the entirety of 93 away from the title picture, and they were just going back to the well here toward the end of the year? That's amazing. Well, and, you know, they were also doing the Lex Luger thing at the time, which, well, we all saw how that went down. Not a whole lot more needs to be said. Then we had a head shrinker squash, which honestly had no need to be as entertaining as it ended up being. Bobby Heenan led the charge with a lot of that on commentary. It was the usual deal where Samu and Fatu just kill a couple pale, out-of-shape geeks. These particular set of job guys look like every prototypical WWF job guy you'd ever seen, including the deal where they forgot to shave their armpits and chest before putting their goddamn singlets on. Probably my favorite part of the whole thing is a spot toward the end where the head shrinkers do a double-team combo to one of the geeks, and when Fatu goes to leave the ring, he stops dead in his tracks so that he can reach down and rip the poor guy's trunks. So this poor dweeb has to continue getting his ass beat for like another minute while his trunks are just kind of dangling. That, of course, allowed for Bobby Heenan to make a Heidi Fleiss pajama joke, wherein apparently she had a line of Velcro-inspired pajama pants that easily came on and off. Something tells me there was an inside joke there that probably went over most of the younglings' heads. And if you know nothing about Heidi Fleiss, just research the first couple paragraphs of her wiki page. I think you'll pick up on where Bobby was going with that comment. And to make things even stranger in this segment, after the head shrinkers go over, they spend about an extra minute of the match caressing one of the job guys' body. I really have no other way to bluntly put that comment. So that is the best term I can come up with. Pretty sure Fatu was also taking the time to smell his boot, which was also very strange. But that took us to the recent episode of WWF Superstars, where the All-Americans got to introduce their replacement partner for the upcoming 4-on-4 tag match. As we all remember, Tatanka had been put on the shelf by the Foreign Fanatics after the Ludwig Borga match a couple weeks ago. And based on the way they addressed it here, you had Lex Luger out there talking about how even though Tatanka was not there physically, he was there in spirit. So if you were watching at home and didn't know any better, you'd have probably thought that Tatanka was dead and that Luger was out there giving a funeral eulogy. Nope, turns out he was just selling a kayfabe injury. But I guess the funeral analogy was apropos for what this all set up, because then we got the revelation of who would be replacing Tatanka in the upcoming Survivor Series match. Drumroll, please. The Undertaker. To which immediately prompted Bobby Heenan to call bullshit on Taker being the replacement guy, because he believed that a suitable replacement partner would have to be alive. You cannot bring in a dead guy to team with you. That is completely unethical. Have I ever mentioned how great Bobby Heenan was? Maybe a time or two. And this led to Undertaker doing a promo to explain why he decided to band together with the All-Americans, somehow in the end turning this promo into a patriotic pro-American value dialogue. And when you just analyze it on the surface, you probably would not think much of it. But when you realize that of all people, this speech was being delivered by The Undertaker, very odd. Now, if you know Mark Calloway personally, you would probably know that he is a very patriotic man, a Texas-born, bike-riding, badass Southerner who just so happened to be working a zombie gimmick in 1993. But he had a good cap to this promo where he said, "Not only will I stand with the All-Americans, but I will survive. Let freedom ring, and let the foreign fanatics rest in peace." Only Taker, man. Only Taker could have pulled that shit off. The true GOAT. Don't ever let anyone try to convince you otherwise. Not just because I'm a mark for him. And of course, for storyline purposes, Taker being inserted into this match, it was the perfect launch into what they were setting up headed into 94 with him and Yoko for the title. But stay posted for that. Then we had the Pierre Lex Luger match. My God. I mean, not to harp on the whole Lex Luger thing. I mean, it's been beaten to death over the years by historians. The whole Lex Express, pro-American, white meat babyface push they were giving him. We all know it utterly failed. But, like, even watching Luger come down for this entrance, he's got all of these screaming fans that are trying to wave the American flags and high-five him. They got the Stars and Stripes march going on. Luger's got the fucking red, white, and blue tights on. Fantastic shape. Looks like a Greek god. And then there's his facial expression. And the whole time he's walking down, his expression just reads, God damn, this gimmick sucks. Like, you knew he totally hated every minute of working this gimmick. And he didn't even try to hide it on camera. He just wanted the hell out by this point. Poor guy. And really all it boiled down to was the wrong dude being saddled with the wrong gimmick. And everybody knew it. I mean, even Vince eventually picked up on it, but he was probably the last to figure it out. I mean, the actual match ended up not being half bad. Luger, it's funny. For so many years, people would always talk about how horrible Lex Luger was in the ring. Like how he was one of the worst in-ring workers to ever receive a main event push in any major wrestling organization. To which my first response is always bullshit, Ultimate Warrior. And that about shuts down that conversation. But I've seen a lot of Luger matches throughout my life. And, granted, he certainly wasn't a Harley Race or a Ric Flair or a Jerry Lawler in the ring by any stretch. But I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't call him horrible in the ring. He wasn't ever a particularly great worker, but to say he was one of the worst, I don't know. I think that's pushing it a little bit. He did perfectly fine in there with Pierre. Funny, too, because they teased a heat spot before the first commercial where Johnny Polo tried to shove Luger outside with his club. Of course, Luger turns around and starts pointing his finger at Polo while Pierre was setting him up from behind. And then right as Luger turns around, he flips Pierre over into a back body drop, and everyone immediately starts cheering because the heel's plan to cheap shot the babyface utterly failed. Now, eventually, Pierre was able to cut off Luger for a little bit of heat. They did a lot of hokey spots where Polo kept teasing he was going to attack Luger behind the ref's back, and right before he could do anything, the ref would catch him, and Polo would have to pretend like he was scratching his back with the club. Polo was actually a great little toady when you go back and remember this version of his gimmick. I really didn't think all that much of him when I was young, but when you take into account that this is the same guy that ended up becoming Raven a few years later, it's almost incredible to think that that was the same guy that worked the Johnny Polo gimmick. Give him credit, man. I like how they pitched their second break here, too. You had Pierre putting Luger in a camel clutch, and while both men are sweating profusely, you start to see Luger stir and try to pick up Pierre onto his back to fight out of the hold. And right as Luger's getting ready to get back to his feet, they cut to commercial and the fans are all on their feet expecting a comeback. And then we come back and Pierre's still working Luger over in the same hold. But, they milked the comeback. Pierre got in some near falls at the end on Luger. And finally, they built to the big 1-2 exchange, which actually looked good, unlike in today's business where everyone's punches look phony and outlaws all get out. Luger eventually makes his comeback, ended up decking Polo with a right hand, who took one of the greatest bumps I've ever seen out to the floor. Even his top hat flew off into the ring, which made it even funnier. And then finally, Luger loads up his arm, and he clocks Pierre with the elbow for the 3 count. And of course, Bobby Heenan is pitching a fit over it because Luger had titanium screws put into his elbow after the surgery he had done on it. So he claims Luger used a foreign object to win, saying, "That arm is loaded." So I'm sure we'll be hearing about this in an ongoing story in the final couple weeks. Overall, not a bad match. I know the Luger critics out there would probably see it differently, but I mean, hey, at least we can say this. He was better than Diesel, who just so happened to conveniently be in the next match. By the way, I'm not sure if we ever talked about this or not, but is it unfair to make the claim that Diesel may have had one of the worst WWF themes of all time? If you actually take the time to listen to it, it is literally a random hodgepodge of truck horns and engine revs. Someone got paid to come up with that theme music. Think about that. I mean, I'll at least give Nash credit here for breaking out a gut-wrench powerbomb. Probably the only time he ever broke out that move in his career. Beyond that, I almost fell asleep watching this. Diesel won with the elbow drop. Then we went to Todd Pettingale for a Survivor Series update, where Pettingale looked like someone had hung him by the shirt in his closet and forgot to take out the hanger. Anyway, he informed us that after the Pierre Luger match from earlier on, it appeared that Pierre suffered a, quote, slight concussion after being hit with Luger's loaded forearm. Is that a medical term? A slight concussion? How does one merely suffer a slight concussion? Well, if it is possible, Pierre apparently suffered one. And right now they're drawing up the story that he may be unable to compete in the Survivor Series match because of it, which would put the babyfaces at the advantage this time, but guess we'll see what happens. Aside from that, they just kind of re-ran down the card, and I alluded to it before, but thank God Smoky Mountain Wrestling was a thing around this point. Otherwise, this might have ranked among the lamest Survivor Series cards of all time. And if you think I'm lying, listen to this match they booked. The Head Shrinkers, Bam Bam Bigelow, and Bastion Booger versus 4 Doinks. Need I say any more? Well, at least we went on a somewhat positive note. Granted, it was another one of those recurring Double J vignettes that seriously felt like they went on for about an eternity and a half. Here he was at a recording studio in Nashville doing auditions, I guess. The only good thing to come out of this is that we had our first on-screen appearance of Jackie Moore. I always liked Jackie. I always had a soft spot for her in the wrestling business. Never had a bad thing to ever say about her career, even when she was forcibly tied with Jeff Jarrett's segments over the years. Of course, by this point, God, she couldn't have been any older than mid to late 20s. And I've got to concede, these fucking insufferable Jeff Jarrett segments where he's just being an obnoxious loudmouth douchebag every week, talking about how they're going to rename the WWF the WJF when he's done with it. As soon as we get to the end of the segment where he does the JEFF, JARRET shtick, got to admit, I fucking lost it. It's just, I can't deny how good of a worker Jeff was in his prime. Even if I absolutely loathed everything about the way he was pushed and featured during the dying days of Nitro or most of his time in TNA, the guy was obviously talented. I always had fun making a mockery of the whole Double J stuff in the WWF because it was obvious they were never going to push him beyond the mid-card scene. Honestly, where Jeff should have been spotlighted for the majority of his career, but not going to get into that whole tirade right now. Like I said, though, I cracked here. Like him cutting off one of the guitar soloists and then storming into the studio to rant about being the best country musician in the world, then doing the slimy Double J shtick at the camera with the smile at the end. I don't know. Of all weeks for me to totally crack, this is the one that did it for me. But at least this was before he was calling everyone slapnuts. A gimmick that also never got over, by the way. Anyway, it was an okay show overall. The Survivor Series show is obviously coming up in the next couple weeks. We'll be covering everything in depth and treating that as part of the Monday podcast extension. Now I just have to carve out some time to actually sit down and watch that full event. Won't be easy, but we'll make time. Don't really have a lot of fond memories of that particular show. And again, if you've been paying attention to the card, you'll figure out why. 4 Doinks. Jerry Lawler's Knights. Bastion Booger. What more can you say? At least we didn't have any Bastion Boogers on SmackDown. We did have the fucking New Day, though, and that wasn't much better. Not to start the SmackDown report on a down note, but yeah, the New Day thing. I just can't do it, man. No matter how hard I try, every single time that goddamn music hits, I instantly become disengaged with anything they're involved with. It's just one of those gimmicks, man. I've hated it since the very beginning. It was something that got over at one point because the fans had an admiration for the three guys in the group. And I should probably say up front, never have I ever stated that I hated the three guys in the New Day faction. I've just said that I hated the actual New Day gimmick. It was just way too cartoony and childish from the onset, at least for the kind of wrestling that I enjoy. But when it comes to Big E, Xavier, and Kofi, I've always been fans of those guys individually. They're all great workers, great talents. You know, the Big E thing is unfortunate with the neck injury in the last year. But, you know, they try to get that New Day thing over to the best of their abilities. It's just not for me. And it never has been. The trombones, the pancakes, the wacky dances, the colorful ring entrance and the tights. It always screamed out Vince McMahon from the very beginning. You know, unfortunately for Kofi, Xavier, and Big E, they were able to accidentally get that gimmick over to such a degree where they just kept rolling with it for the better part of almost 8 years. So they wrestled the Usos for the tag belts here. And the story here was that if the Usos successfully beat the New Day, they would not only retain the belts, but they would also top the New Day's reign as the longest reigning tag team champions in company history. So it was evident we were going to get this match at some point. You know, problem too is that I've seen so many of these goddamn Usos New Day matches, and just this year alone, you know, that also kind of took me out of this thing. Because I even talked about it on my Crown Jewel review last weekend. Even Usos matches don't really do a whole lot for me anymore. Like, I've seen pretty much every style of the Usos match they can have. They're really not all that unique or different at this point. I mean, I mostly just wanted to see what they'd end up doing for a finish here. So I skipped all the way to the end to see what they would end up doing. I mean, this thing almost went the entire first half hour of the fucking show, so there's a lot of fast forwarding I was doing. And considering how botched that finish came off in execution, boy, am I glad I didn't waste my time watching the whole thing if that was going to be the finish. Basically, they do a spot at the end where Kofi tried to fight off the Usos on the top turnbuckle, and when he went to jump off the top rope, the Usos kind of caught him in a really awkward-looking 1D where even Michael Cole didn't know exactly how to call it. Like, it was obviously what they were going for, but it was so poorly mistimed, even the announcers weren't sure how to call the spot. So that finish sucked the cock. But at least the Usos can stake their claim as the longest reigning tag team champions in company history, so they have that moniker now. Kind of expected that was the direction they would end up going. I guess I also wouldn't have been surprised if they would have had Sami Zayn interfere last minute to fuck everything up, but I mean, considering how long they've invested in that story, it was probably wiser just to put Jimmy and Jay over here. You know, set up something for later on with the bloodline when the story would actually call for it. I still wouldn't roll out Sami being the reason the Usos or Roman end up losing their belts at some point, but for where we are right now in the developmental stages of everything, this is fine for what they were trying to do. So then, completely at random, they announced this 3-week-long World Cup series that they'll be hosting on SmackDown, with the winner not only receiving a future Intercontinental title shot, but also winning a prestigious trophy. And part of me is actually wondering whether the only reason they did this tournament to begin with was so they had an excuse to use the term trophy on television again. Because we all know Vince hated that word. Come to think of it, didn't he hate the word tournament too? So maybe this was a twofer. Hunter really sticking it to the man. Anyway, so, yeah, they're doing a World Cup tournament with the following participants: Brawny the Strowman, Ricochet, Shinsuke Nakamura, Sami Zayn, Butch, Mustafa Ali, Santos Escobar, and Jinder Mahal. And as soon as I saw the graphic come up for Jinder, the first thing I said was, that guy still has a job, huh? Wonder how many people are still riding the don't hinder Jinder train. Good times. By the way, I should also point this out. They did a horrible job actually explaining what countries these guys were representing. Some are pretty self-explanatory, but in the case of someone like Ricochet, I was like, what is his nationality exactly? Have they ever talked about that on television at all? So the first round was Nakamura and Escobar. And I guess these guys have been feuding on the television show recently, which is why they were paired off together in the first round. Odd, because I don't think I've actually talked about a Shinsuke Nakamura segment on any of the SmackDown reports yet. I don't even remember physically seeing him on camera until this very show. Apparently he snuck in the back door when I wasn't paying attention. Probably because last I checked, Legado del Fantasma was feuding with Hit Row, and pretty much anything involving Hit Row at this point, I actively skip over because most of their shit is straight trash. I like the match. Everything except for the fake 1-2 punches where both guys are just standing there not selling anything back and forth. You know, it's kind of astonishing to me how much of an epidemic this is in modern wrestling. I have no idea where this started or who popularized the no-sell forearm exchanges, but whoever did ought to be blacklisted and castrated. But, they end up billing to a series of spots where Escobar's lackeys kept trying to run interference, but Nakamura kept taking them all out. Eventually did a spot where Nakamura cut one of them off with a left knee, which he had been selling for most of the match. So when he got back on the apron, Escobar ended up cutting him off, put him on the top rope, hit him with the Phantom Driver for the 3 count. So that was that. Kind of a shame to see what they've done with Nakamura in the last several years in WWE. He was definitely one of my favorite dudes to watch in NXT at one point, and they put the title on him. He had a great series of matches with a whole lot of guys. Remember how incredibly over that guy was at one point, too. And the thing that sucks is that even if they missed the boat with him on the main roster for the first year or so, didn't he end up winning the Royal Rumble one year? And so Vince was obviously high on the guy at one point. But, it's been a few years now, and here he is in 2022 just kind of spinning his wheels. I mean, like I talked about before, I almost completely forgot the guy existed until he randomly showed back up here to wrestle. I figured if he wasn't on the federal witness protection list, he was probably on the chopping block to be cut at some point. Yeah, I know some people aren't really all that big on Nakamura. I've always said it's kind of like the Riddle thing with me. I've always viewed Nakamura as an acquired taste. Yeah, he's a little bit wacky. Some of his offense and mannerisms are unorthodox. But, the guy's obviously talented. He knows how to wrestle. He has that weird sort of charisma that stands out when you watch him in the moment. Like I said, if they hadn't buried him into oblivion in the last few years, I'd probably have been more stoked to watch him wrestle again. For what it was fine. But buried in the middle of the show and then beating him flat at the end of it, I don't know, it really didn't get me excited to see what the future holds for Nakamura. If Hunter even has plans for him at all, which, judging by the outcome here, maybe he doesn't. Tell you who he better have plans for, though. Yeah. And his name is L.A. Knight. Let me talk to you.
Let me talk to you.
Well, this had potential. Didn't exactly end up leaning in the direction I was expecting. I was expecting Knight to get a chance to cut a heel promo, since, the guy can actually talk. And he was talking for a little bit. He was mentioning something about being left out of the World Cup tournament. And then in the middle of his promo, they begin flashing up a bunch of Bray Wyatt clips on the Tron behind him. And when Knight turns around and yells at the production team to get this crap out of here during his time, Bray magically appears in the frame and starts doing his usual nonsensical psychobabble. Long story short, LA Knight starts to badmouth Bray, and when he goes to stick his head toward Bray, Uncle Howdy appears on the big screen, and Bray apparently snaps and then headbutts Knight and drops him on the ground. And then when Knight gets back up and he's clutching his jaw, he starts going, "Where did he go?" So I guess we're intended to believe that Bray vanished from sight? All right, then. I really want to like where this is going. I really would like to give them the benefit of the doubt. It's really teetering that fine line of either being good or ridiculously stupid. Unfortunately, I don't think this is a case where there will be any middle ground. Now, the idea of Bray Wyatt and LA Knight in a feud on paper doesn't seem like a bad idea. I have no idea who the hell we're supposed to cheer for in that scenario because, well, LA Knight is clearly a heel. Bray, I have no idea what side of the fence he's going to fall on by the time this is all done. The normal Bray Wyatt always gets a babyface pop for just being his normal self. The Uncle Howdy Halloween-inspired nonsense, that I have some reservations about. You know, the problem is if they drag LA Knight into any of this tomfoolery and it ends up being a four-finger stinker by the end, you know, all it's going to do is kill LA Knight's momentum dead in the water. So I don't know where they're going with this, but I'm still very uneasy about how it all turns out. Again, it's the track record of Bray Wyatt. I want to like his stuff. I know he obviously believes in everything he does. He always comes off very convincing in his delivery. But when the reality hits you that the actual material he's given is mostly garbage, makes it really hard to stay optimistic about it. That's all I'll say. So after this, they did a four-way girls match to determine Ronda's opponent for the Survivor Series title match, which Shotzi Blackheart won. To which I said, fuck off with that drivel. Glad I didn't waste 15 minutes of my life watching that, especially if that was going to be the payoff. Ronda Rousey versus Shotzi Blackheart. No thank you. That has indie train wreck written all over it. So what else did we have on this show? There was a quick little pre-tape in the back with Ricochet and Gunther, wherein Ricochet talked about competing in the World Cup tournament next week and still never indicating what nationality he's representing. At this point, I still don't know the answer to that question. Hopefully they'll bother to explain it when he wrestles Ali. Then we had another first-round match in the World Cup. All natural, definitely not on the juice, Jinder Mahal versus Brawny the Strowman. And this went pretty much as expected. It went about 2 minutes. Mahal tried to jumpstart Strowman before the bell, but Strowman cut him off very quickly and then took him out on the floor with a shoulder tackle. Then he threw him back in. Powerbomb, 1, 2, 3. Exactly what it needed to be. Sorry to any of the people out there that are still on the Jinder Mahal bandwagon. Guess I'll have to keep on pumping iron at the gym and contemplate whether or not he'll be the next to get future endeavored. Can you actually believe that guy is still under contract? How many years has it been? Good Lord. Real quick before we get to the main event segment, didn't want to touch on this. They had another tease of Hit Row working a TV match. And apparently because the cat is already out of the bag that they all suck and couldn't wrestle their way out of a wet paper bag, this was all set up to re-debut the Viking Raiders. Vignettes that I have seen sporadically on the show and really haven't commented all that much on it. Mostly because I figured this is what it was. I still preferred when they went by Hanson and Rowe over Eric and Ivar, but you know Vince. Anyway, they jumped Legado del Fantasma and Hit Row here. Pretty much wrecked shop and killed everyone at ringside. We also had the returning Sarah Logan show back up. Actually looking pretty badass in that Viking getup. The cool face paint, the dreadlocks, kind of made her stand out. I guess they're heels. That's what I got out of it. You know, I always thought War Machine was a cool tag team back in the day. I saw a little bit of their stuff in Ring of Honor before they signed their developmental contracts. And the stuff I did see from them in NXT was pretty damn good from what I remember. You know, main roster run is always kind of a different story. But they're obviously talented big men. They can move, they can work, they got unique looks. I'm interested to see what Hunter's got in store for them on SmackDown. The heel thing for me is sort of a head scratcher. Not because they couldn't work that role, but factoring in how deflated the tag team division is right now in terms of top challengers that go after the titles. I don't know, I kind of figured since the Usos are technically heels, wouldn't it make sense to bring them back as baby faces to eventually set them up to be future title challengers? I mean, the Usos have got to eventually drop those straps, right? I mean, who better to lose them to than two badass-looking monster dudes in Viking outfits? But that's probably my only nitpick about the execution of the return. We'll see what they have programmed for them in the future. But in the final segment of the show, we had Roman Reigns out there with the Bloodline for a special announcement. With approximately 10 minutes and change left of airtime. So whatever he was going to say, he was going to have to get to the point relatively quickly here. 5 of those 10 minutes being stalled with Paul Lee doing a heat promo on the Indianapolis fans and talking about how no one compares to the Usos in terms of all-time great rivalries. And just when you think that train wreck television does not exist, here come the Brawling Brutes for a fight, including the returning Sheamus with a malfunctioning mic. And while he is desperately trying to cut a babyface promo on Roman, it is completely incomprehensible to everybody in the building. So, of course, Roman, in thinking on his feet, like a great heel would do, he goes, "Dude, you can't even get the fucking mic to work. What are you going to do?" Live TV, folks. What are you going to do? Well, in any case, they get into the brawl, evidently with the Bloodline gaining the numbers advantage, but not before Drew McIntyre's music hits and he runs down to even the odds. And that was actually a nice touch, too, because, you know, they drew attention to the Cardiff title match with Roman and Drew, where Sikoa debuted and fucked Drew out of the belt. So it's good to see that they're throwing him back into the title equation with the Bloodline and not losing sight of that. You know, and of course, they do the chaotic show closing brawl with everyone doing a bunch of windmill punches and not so convincing looking fighting spots. Oh yeah, and did I mention Sheamus's mic didn't work? Poor guy. I'm sure he was pissed about that one. You know, but it looks like they're setting up the Survivor Series tag match out of this. Or actually, it might be War Games. Now that I think about it, I read somewhere that was rumored the direction they were going for the Survivor Series theme this year. And that could be a good match. You know, the Bloodline versus the Brawling Brutes and Drew McIntyre. I'm not sure how Sammy fits into that whole equation, but, you know, I'm sure he'll be factored in somehow. So, yeah, I mean, not a great final segment to the show, but, you know, in terms of heading into a new story direction, I thought it was effective. Looks like the Karrion Kross thing is done for now. Logan Paul was nowhere to be seen this week, so that was obviously a one and done. And now they're going back to the well and revisiting some of their earlier feuds, so that's all well and good. Not the greatest SmackDown of all time, but definitely not a bad one. Now we just wait and see how things turn out next weekend when we add Full Gear into the mix. I think I talked about it on this past week's show. I will be doing a card preview this coming Friday. As of now, there are 3 matches off the top of my head that I know for a fact are happening. One of which I am slightly apprehensive about, considering the history of their injuries. But this is AEW we're talking about here, so if something were to go horribly awry, that would be the match right there for it to happen. We'll talk more in depth about everything else next week, but as we wrap things up here, let me just sort of throw this out as we get closer to the Starrcade 86 and Survivor Series 93 shows. They are relatively close together in terms of their dates and history. The Starrcade 86 show, we are going to include that review on the Friday podcast. And the following Monday, we will review the Survivor Series show in full. That way we don't try to cram in 2 long events in one sitting, because I don't think I'll have the energy to do that, nor the time. We'll still do the Retro Raw and SmackDown reports, so if you enjoy those segments of the podcast, you'll still get those. Beyond that, though, I think we'll be in good shape through the remainder of the year. As we wind down, I'm still factoring in what I would like to do toward the end of 2022 in terms of like a major episode spectacular. Probably would be a similar format to what we did last year. We ran down our top matches of the year, and I kind of recounted some of the better moments of 2021. There weren't too many of them to my recollection. 22's kind of been an up and down year, but yeah, there have definitely been some memorable moments and great matches worth discussing, so that'll be something we factor in as the year comes to a close. I still have that list saved somewhere in my Word document folder, so when I find it, I'll have to make sure it's up to date. And I think that'll about do it for this one. Check out Nick Aldis' podcast with Sam Roberts, where he talks about his decision to leave the NWA. It's only about an hour long, but it's a very insightful interview. One that I think will resonate with a lot of frustrated fans of that product in the last couple years. Especially if you spent the better part of the last year checking out the NWA reports on my channel. Talked about how horrendous the booking of that product was for a long time, and now we finally have someone from the inside dropping truth bombs that, quite frankly, I think a lot of people need to eventually hear, including the people in management. So, whether or not you agree with them, good on Nick for finally speaking out and talking about how poorly that product's been run. You know, I've just never had the platform to get the message out to a broader audience, but I mean, come on, if you watch the show, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. And now that their main guy is basically deciding to step down and he wants nothing to do with the product at this point, it's clear that message is going to get out on a larger scale. You know, Billy Corgan losing Nick Aldis, that's nothing to scoff at. That's a real bullet that company's going to be taking. You know, he was their best worker, their best promo, easily one of their few highlights of the show in the last 12 months. It's on par with AEW losing CM Punk. Definitely on a lesser scale, but I don't think that product's going to be any better off with Nick Aldis out of the picture. You know, whatever he decides to do with his career going forward, best of luck to him. I hope he doesn't retire, because he probably has a couple peak years left in his prime. I would hate to see him go to AEW and get wasted away like everyone else in that godforsaken product does. Although when you think about it, Nick Aldis and MJF in an AEW world title program, it's not a bad idea. It's probably one of the more enticing things they could really do at this point. Or he could go to WWE and feud with the likes of Cody Rhodes or Roman Reigns. That would be equally as good, more than likely. So, keep your eyes peeled for Aldis. He may be showing up somewhere when you least expect it. Anyhow, thanks for tuning in all. Peace out.